Okay, welcome to episode 37 of the Following Mechanical Turks project. Past two sessions, we've had a couple of guests speak with us about working with human subjects and potential hit design, also sort of theoretical questions of what we're kind of focusing in on, readability, but then how that may attach to other concepts in forms like captioning and alt text description or whatever. Those are also, in a sense, kind of roundabout ways to think about hits as well. So today we're just going to sort of chat about what we've taken from those guests and then think about sort of next steps in terms of hit design and that kind of stuff. So that's the gist of what we're going to be doing. Nathaniel, I contacted you because we previously discussed that since we are going to be posting hits for the next research product, we are going to need to pay for those, right? I mean, that's one thing we've discussed is compensation and how that, is not only necessary to what we're doing, but how it can potentially be an aspect of what we're doing. Although I think we may still kind of need to untangle that. But I was able to get some grant funding. It's a Cahill grant through my school so that we can pay for those hits. We just need to have all that spent by April the 30th, which is, I don't think, a problem. That's on our timeline anyway.
Yeah.
That would be, getting all that stuff out and at least having responses by the end of that semester, essentially, and then, right up during the summer.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the gist of that, and I guess where we are. Am I overlooking anything?
No, I think that about covers it.
Okay.
Yeah, no, I thought, the last two conversations were really helpful, although their helpfulness is now manifesting in as with this whole project, right? It sort of keeps getting bigger and then smaller and then bigger. And so I think after particularly the conversation with Sean last time, thinking about how to approach readability, in particular, the kind of the language he was providing for like the things that captions do, right? The captions can clarify, formalize, and equalize, right? He gave us this terminology that was really useful, or the idea of readability can function in a binary context, right? The caption's either right or wrong. It's either present or absent.
Yeah.
Right. And then thinking about now what would be hits that would sort of get Turkers to work through that, right? And which then comes back to the conversation we had with Kegel, right? Are we simply testing them, right? Are we messing with them, and not necessarily in a bad sense, right? Are there, in other words, right, thinking about how does that sort of those useful ways of thinking about readability impact the way that we would design hits?
Yeah.
Like, does that if we define readability a certain way in a hit, does that result in different kinds of readability being generated? Although that then, the more I think about that, the more that moves us away from part of what this second project is supposed to be about, which is gauging the perspectives of Turkers, right? So how do we still do that while also, I guess like the risk always for me is with any kind of project is the example becomes the thing that I get really interested in, and I forget what it's supposed to be an example of, right? Readability for us is our way into thinking about the experience of Turkers. but in my own mind, it's increasingly becoming the thing I'm actually more interested in than the experience of Turkers, which is potentially an issue.
Well, I mean, so that's kind of a central question. And I mean, I can tell you where I've been sort of aligning, because after the first product, it's even sort of in the conclusion where, in fact, let me pull that up. Go to the text, where it sort of alludes to, well, given what we've found, here's where we go from here. That's, I think it's kind of right at the end. It's a pretty subsequent study that addresses this aspect. How Turkers engage M-Turk, right?
Yeah.
But in thinking about that, right, because I mean, you know, a thing we've already addressed is, well, I mean, if that's the question, then it seems like there's a straightforward way of doing that, which is like a survey. Tell us how you know, I mean, we'd need questions that address this, but, you know, break down into, give us insight into how you interact with the service. So, you know, that would suggest things like, how do you make your choices? And how do you do this and that? The thing of it is, as we've talked about in previous episodes, one, I'm not, that's not quite, that question, for one, isn't one that's really necessarily immediately within the purview of our discipline and our ability. I mean, it's like social science, it's sort of like straight up social science questions, right? Not necessarily ethnography itself. I mean, you could do an ethnography of M-Turkers, but that would be different than just surveying them. I mean, those are both methods to get at explicating how this group behaves. But it's like, one, that's not really what we do. I mean, you know, rhetoric is tough to define as a discipline because its borders are kind of vague. But there's that aspect of it. There's the additional aspect of, we don't really do that. I mean, we can. And Kegel talked a lot about this, I think, where she was like, you know, the keeping sort of a foot in different disciplines when doing human subjects research. And, you know, she talked about learning on the fly and that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
That's one aspect of it. Another aspect of that is some of that work is already done.
Yeah.
In other areas like journalism. Now, a lot of the journalism we saw, and this is, you know, some feedback we got, presents understandably a fairly biased picture. Now, I mean, bias is unavoidable, but, you know, a lot of what we get from journalism, the kind of main line is, this is bad, these people are being exploited. This also happens in scholarship as well. You know, the kind of default, the enthymematic, you know, presumption there is, this is bad and exploitative. And then we go looking for evidence of that by saying, look at the way these people are exploited.
Yeah, no, unrelated, and I won't name the title of the article, but the title of the article is like a question. And I'm like, yeah, that's, I bet the answer, I bet I know what the answer is. Yeah, like
and that's not to say that's untrue. And I mean, I think that's something Kegel ended with, was sort of like, by the way,
yeah,
this is bad and exploitative. And that, you know, I mean, you know, she pointed to Bezos himself, who, you know, has some socio-political positions backed by a lot of funding.
Yeah.
We shouldn't just wipe that away and say, yes, but we're studying something else. So the ethical entanglements are secondary to our intellectual pursuits, right? There's a case to be made for that, but you do have to ignore certain things to make that case.
Yeah. But what's interesting too, though, is the feedback about, I mean, what's interesting is, and this gets sort of the perspective of our first piece, which was sort of from the perspective of the system, how is the human being articulated? And that's oftentimes where the critiques are made, right? That this is bad because of the kinds of practices that Amazon is engaged in. And at that point, you'll probably get no argument from me. A lot of the people that are critical of that approach aren't Amazon people. It's Turkers. right? There's a subset of Turkers that likes M Turk,
Right.
and they're the ones that you'll hear from saying that the sort of the mainstream critique of M Turk, that right, it's the defenders of M Turk aren't all Amazon employees, although
Right.
of course they're Turkers, which in a perfect world they might be treated as such as opposed to contingent labor. Um, but so it's really interesting so far as, right, if one were then to ethically engage in Turkers and try to sort of work from their perspective, one then has to be right. The more because we've sort of talked about this, right? The more critical we are, or we are read to be as in our project, the less interested Turkers are going to be in our project.
Yeah, and that's, not speculative. We have received some feedback to that extent that, you know, um, that yes, I mean, from a particular perspective, and that was, kind of literally the feedback is a lot of outsiders kind of dip into this to make a kind of ethical case, but they're not engaged in the day to day. I mean, as you say, they're not people who make their living doing this rightly or wrongly. They're not people who, if not, literally Turkers themselves, are Turker adjacent in terms of providing third-party services that do things that enable Turkers, right? I mean, it's like a lot of other kind of ethical judgments we impose, and I'm not saying that's wrong because it's probably unavoidable. If you're engaging with something, you're doing it through some form of subjectivity for no other reason. What did you choose to look at? What language did you choose to encapsulate it? Right? I mean, it's
Right.
unavoidable to say, just give us the facts. I mean, it's like, we're rhetoricians. It's such a ridiculous BS pose.
Right.
But anywho, yeah. So, as you say, there are people who would advocate, just sort of casting stones from outside has effects. I mean, it can devalue the platform, and the platform is valuable to a lot of people who make their living solely or partially based on this. I mean, you could point to something like what we call adjunct labor, right? I mean, that for us to point fingers at M Turk.
First, yeah.
What's that?
No, I mean that's the joke, right? Is
Yeah.
the best way of describing Uber is like, what if we had adjunct faculty but for cab drivers? I mean,
Yeah.
Started it.
I mean, our industry, and it is an industry, depends upon work that is no less exploitative than any other, right? I mean, we have people who are highly trained, highly educated, but then put in position in many situations, but not all, put in positions where that is not valued the way that potentially it could be, right? People who are in labor situations that are tentative, that do not have benefits anyway.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess the point is, we're looking at the mote in someone else's eye without acknowledging the beam in our own.
Yeah.
I hear agreement or consternation in the background.
Or it's just how my daughter talks to herself, which is interesting.
I use the first person plural when I talk to myself. Like I'll say, we need to go get when I'm alone, we need to go get gas in the car because we're almost out of it. I'm not sure. I've always done that. I'm not sure where it's coming from.
I get that looked at.
No dice. I'm not opening that can of worms. I can only juggle so many crises.
Yeah.
Anywho.
Yeah.
So, I mean, all of this is to say, there are a lot of ways to pursue where to go next. And also, there's also the question of, when we say Turkers, whom do we mean? Because, if we're looking at people who do hits, that's part of it. But because the issue of readability surfaced in the first product, there's a larger circle potentially of people who engage in hits, people who are Turkers, who aren't just those who do hits. And so, also that could encompass people who compose hits, right?
Yeah. No, I think that's what we were sort of, and that was, I think, useful. I think Kay got us to think about that whole question of like subject versus participant. And in many ways, right, that oftentimes, I mean, I kind of fell into this too, right, that when you look at the mechanical Turk system and you imagine who Turkers are, I jump too quickly to, it's the people doing the hits. But essentially everybody in it is the Turker, right? That the person composing I mean, admittedly, they're potentially doing it from a different, potentially from a more privileged position, right? They're working for a company that's now outsourcing this particular labor, right? But to participate in Mechanical Turks, there's lots of ways in which that can look.
Well, and I mean, in part because of what we were looking at is stuff like, to use our term we surfaced is, the readability of a hit. And why, I mean, that came up in some of the sort of feedback was why certain hits succeed or fail in the parlance of our times, because of the way they are written, right? It's like, well, this is a poorly written hit, or not even a binary of is it well or poorly written, but it's like what this is communicating. Like, I'm not going to spend the time to untangle what this is communicating because I've got to do a lot of these rapidly, right? So, I mean, there's real questions, rhetoric questions of readability, of composition and audience that you don't necessarily get at completely, not that you ever do, but just by asking a survey to a Turker saying, hey, how do you adjudicate which hits to do? I mean, that's definitely a component of that, but it's not the component of what happens when you write a hit this way versus that way.
Yeah.
I mean, as Kegel pointed out, like, I think she just straight up asked, like, are you guys doing A/B testing with some different hits?
Yeah.
And it was like, yeah, I mean, I think we kind of are. And that's why she led us to, by the end of it, kind of this interesting position of, well, if that's what you want to do, then what you do is just the A/B of your hit, and then that's it, right? It's like once they click it, I mean, do you remember that? Where she was like, if that's what you want, then your test is just A/B the hit. And then when they go to the hit, just pay them.
Yeah.
Like what they've done is what you want. And I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah.
I'm still kind of on the fence about just that because, I mean, what you may get back is something like, well, everybody just clicked it just because it was there and we paid everybody and therefore there's no real A/B differentiation. I mean, what we'd have to do is determine something like how quickly did one get full rather than the other, or, I mean, it sort of changes the nature of what you're doing. Also, it precludes the ability to do a little more fine-grained work inside the hit itself, which we've talked about before, something like, questions like which of these summaries, or, I mean, we talked about, options like, look at this picture. Which of these 4 options is the most readable summary of this picture? Just to be, quite concrete here.
Yeah.
Now, if you're just paying them for accessing the hit, you don't get the ability to ask those kinds of questions and see what the feedback is. Like, okay, well, a huge percentage picked option 3. To me, it's like, well, that is valuable in and of itself. It says something.
Right.
I mean, it doesn't answer all the questions of, okay, so what we have to do is pick a pathway at some point here, and probably sooner rather than later, because it's going to have to go through IRB.
And that April deadline is going to sneak up on us.
Yeah, I mean, we want to do that quickly so that, I mean, when it does go through IRB, I think it'll be expedited because, ultimately, what we're asking people to do are hits, which are going to be, essentially survey stuff. So I think it'll be relatively rapid because the risk there is low. These are not medical tests.
Right.
But there are caveats like, is this related to COVID? Because if not, we'll see you in a few months,
I think I talked about this a couple of weeks ago. I just now, as a member of a committee, pre-approved an IRB proposal for a project a student's working on in the Writing Center. That's like 6-7 months old at this point. Because the IRB office just told her, "Is this a vaccine for COVID? Okay, get bent." Like,
Right. Right. I mean, there's the very real chance that other things are going to get priority. And so, we need to consider that. So anywho, sooner rather than later. But I think, ultimately what we are doing is going to be posting some hits of some sort and then working with the feedback we get. Now, what those hits are, I think there's a spectrum of options ranging from potentially, as Kegel kind of outlined, ones that are more or less, just you look at them and therefore you get paid.
yeah,
In which case the readability that we are examining is all kind of located on like the hit post itself.
yeah,
That almost at that point is then readability kind of largely, if not exclusively, from the perspective of the composer, the hit composer, right?
yeah. My note here was like, how do we think through a post that's able to get, right, going back to what you said earlier, right, that readability essentially moves up and down, right? There's the readability of hits, which is, as we sort of suspect, that a lot of the hits we ended up looking at in our first product were potentially hits that were still around because of how readable they were. So how do we create a series of hits wherein the Turkers, the readability of the hit is, I mean, so in part, this goes back to maybe where I started, right? Is if we think through that potentially some of the, if we're running these hits sort of like experiments, right? That do we offer a similar hit, right? We give them some alt text, right? Which of these is more readable,
right,
than the other? But in each of those, but there's different ways in which readability is described in the hit.
Or even just for example, if you change concept and you have hits that are essentially identical, but that say which is the most readable summary, and then in the next one, the next hit that the different Turker would take would be which is the best summary or something like that. I mean, what are the differences if you just even change terminology? Does it illuminate that readability is something different than accuracy? Right. What's that? Your mic kind of cut.
Oh, sorry. No, right. We would do that. We would ask one would ask for the most readable. One would ask for the most, I mean, again, spitballing, right? Most legible.
Yeah.
Accurate, most compelling. And then you would see, does asking the question that way change what readability is for the Turker?
Or identify at least that there is a difference between, because I mean, a lot of what we looked at in the first product was distinctions between concepts.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what a lot of the results were particularly as mapped to things like compensation, what's the difference between this as a concept and that as a concept? So, I mean, one way we can engage that directly is just straight up see, do people engage with things differently based on the conceptual frame?
Yeah. Which would then be a way of also getting at how are we as hit composers making readability readable?
Yeah, intelligible to an audience. So, I mean, that's another, and I guess a spectrum doesn't quite it's not a spectrum so much as options, right? Where we've got like the radical hit that kind of Kegel talked to us about, where it's A B and it's all sort of compositional. And we talked about it right at the end, where it's like, how do you invest your participants by valuing their time, by acknowledging they're human, thank you, here's your money, right? There's another option, which is, and Kegel talked about this as well, where they're not really participants, they're subjects at this point, where what they do for us is illuminate something, like where it's like, we do this hit, they give us feedback on that hit, and then we use that information. And as she said, it's like, that's fine, just be aware of what you're doing. They're not really participants, they're subjects at that point. They're just kind of stuff giving you feedback. As you can imagine, just like the platform invites, you could do this with a robot as well. Here's your input, spit out output for us.
Well, because that's the whole, that's the project writ large is you could potentially have a robot do that, right? That's Mechanical Turk. That's the issue it puts on the table.
Well, and it's why, kind of when we were first thinking about this, it's like, what would be the difference between us writing this question versus GPT-3 writing the question, right?
Yeah.
Where it quite literally is. It's like, we're having us do it, we're having a robot do it. That's still on the table, but access to GPT-3 has been a little, I don't know if that's open, but there are still potential ways to get at that sort of thing. There are other text generation services, whatever. But at that point, the position of, and I think Kegel kind of illuminated this, it's like, they're not participants just because you say they are, right?
Right.
I think it's good to be conscious of the difference, but just saying, well, these are, we see them as participants, we want to value what it is they do, but we're still just treating them as subjects, right? It's not inherently bad, but it's like, it's like saying in any other kind of situation where it's like, I want to value diversity and input, but my action is not really, it's just me saying it is the only difference, is that I'm foregrounding it, but everything else is the same. New boss, same as the old boss.
Yeah. Yeah.
Anyway,
like next week we have some listening sessions with the administration here.
Sure.
We value your input. Are you going to do anything with it? Well, no.
No, but it is not. We value it to the extent of saying we value it.
Right. Yeah, you're right.
Which maybe is not nothing, but it, I think the same, I think Kegel, I don't want to put words in her mouth, but I think that's kind of something that was underpinning it is, we can say we value them as participants, but you're not valuing them as participants, you're treating them as subjects. We haven't done it yet. Yeah. But that is, and she did say, she's like, that's fine, but be conscious of what you're really doing.
Well, and what's interesting is, this gets it, maybe this is something that we just put off for the third one. Right, that the difference between, there's also a sense conceptually, or in that theoretical third product, that the difference between participant and subject is itself also not something you can know ahead of time. Right? What's the difference between a participant and a subject? And how can you know that outside of a particular task? Right? That in other words, right, if part of what we're getting at is you can't use an essentialist notion of human to sort out what's happening in Mechanical Turks, it seems like the difference between participant and subject is just a way to sneak it back in.
Yeah, well, and that kind of,
right. Well, participants involve some level of autonomy. Right. That you've now just rolled, right. You've now just reinscribed humanism back into the whole thing.
Well, that's kind of it, because, another option, the third option here is like ethnographic work, where it's like, you embed yourself within the Turk or community, you, collect a lot of different formats of documents. And I think that may lend itself to a more participational, and Kegel talked about this, compensation for, the kind of project she was talking about, and keeping in touch with those people, right? I mean, do you remember when she was talking about doing some ethnography and, you know, becoming, not necessarily like, a part of a particular community, but I mean, maybe, I mean, in a way, not a part in the same sense as other community members, but still like within it in some sense.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's kind of a question. It's like, potentially the framing of the hit itself may invite that kind of essentialism, right? Because if the hit is, look at this photo and pick a corresponding caption, does that induce a notion of what you are, right? This hit now induces you to be a subject versus a hit that may induce you to be a participant.
Yeah, because that's kind of what we're getting at, right? How does the hit itself produce the outcome, right? That it's within a Turk that humanness emerges. Well, then that participant or subject is at stake in a hit, not a thing you use to categorize a hit.
Yeah.
Because it could be, and it would work differently, right? I mean, the sense we get is that some people, when they do Turk work, feel like subjects. We've also heard from people who feel like participants.
Yeah.
And I imagine they're all working from the same list of hits.
Yeah. And that may hinge on, oh, sorry.
No,
I think your mic must be, it must cut on and off based on when you talk, right? It must, yeah. Anywho, shit. What were we talking about? Yeah, I mean, right. So, I mean, that may hinge on things like, sense of autonomy, right? I mean, some would say, well, I mean, I have the autonomy of, I don't have to do this and I get to choose what I want to do.
Yeah.
And in some ways that's very different than being paid to be told what to do, right? I mean, there is a sense in which the gig economy, and I think the gig economy plays this angle up, is empowering in certain ways. I think that's a fair assertion. It is empowering in certain ways. It is also potentially not empowering, encumbering in certain ways. I think those can both be true.
Yeah. Yeah, sort of like you can choose to do this or starve. I mean, it's your choice.
Well, that is a very kind of American notion of aligning agency with choice. I mean, goodness gracious. I mean, it's dominating the, COVID mask situation in ways that are perhaps not surprising, ghastly, but not surprising.
Yeah. I mean, I wonder if this gets to, like, is a hit that involves multiple choice versus short answer more likely to generate feelings of subjectivity or participant?
Well, see, this is an interesting question because, like, just thinking of the practicalities of the hit, I was like, well, and this came up with Kegel as well. It was like, asking a Turker to like write a readable summary. That's a whole thing because it's like, how do we then on the background, on the back end, process that, right? Unless we, sorry, do you listen to my brother and me?
No.
Okay. Unless is a key term for them. Okay. Because once they answer a question, there's often a point where they'll say unless, and then they propose something absurd. But unless, picking up what Kegel is talking about, is maybe what we want is not the summary they write. That is, in a sense, a pose. What we want is some either metadata aspect of that, or something like write a readable summary and then a question that is somehow getting to the notion of how did that make you feel?
Well, I think that I think was our response to Kegel's A/B. Like, that's great. Like that would be a really great way of doing it. But we want a box at the end that says, okay, which one of these, like when you go to IKEA, pick the face that best describes your experience of this post.
Yes.
We don't just want them to generate data. We want a sense of what making that data was like for them.
But I mean, maybe there's a way to do that where, I mean, imagine two separate hits where one is, pick the most readable summary of this paragraph. And then another question, and this would probably be bad design, but I mean, just envision that. And then another question, which is like, how much agency do you feel you have, or how respected as a Turker do you think you are on a Likert scale, right? 1 to 0 to 5 or whatever. How respected did you feel by this hit, or something like that, or how much did this hit? How do you feel this hit is compensating you appropriately for what you did? 0 to 5, right?
Yeah.
Then B, write a 1-sentence readable summary of this paragraph. Second question, what's that?
How did that make you feel?
Yes, same exact, because what we're trying to get at is question 2. Did this hit waste your time or not? Or do you think this was an appropriate hit or whatever, right? That's the same question. The first question is different, which is pick a summary versus generate a summary, right? And in both cases, we're probably just throwing out question 1. Do you know what I mean? We don't really care about the results of question 1. We care about the results of question 2. Did this multiple choice hit? Did that respect you, versus you were asked to write something? Did that respect you?
Yeah, or we do care about both because the difference is important. And depending on how, now we're getting into design, should that be one hit, or we have a hit where they do multiple choice readability and we ask them how we feel, and then there's a separate hit where they write it and we ask them? Or does that have to happen in the same?
I think you separate those.
Yeah, they're two.
I'm not a psychometrician.
Right. I'm wondering, right? Because all part of this, do this and then respond. Now do this and respond. Were you imagining that as one hit, or were those two separate hits?
It's an interesting question because it would also come with things like compensation difference. So asking somebody to write something probably comes at a different compensation rate than asking somebody to pick. Asking somebody a multiple choice survey question is probably compensated differently than asking somebody to generate a readable summary.
Yeah. And now there's another variable that we'd have to, right? The difference between these hits are because of the way we ask them to generate readability. And someone says, yeah, but the compensation levels were also different. And that is potentially confounding your results.
Yeah, and I mean, there's even another depth of the rabbit hole, which is the first hit is write a 1-sentence summary of this, and then question 2. Oh, we got it. We got a visitor. And then the second iteration is we have selected some of those summaries, and you're asking another pool to pick which of these 5 is the most readable.
That was actually something I'm going to take credit for this, because I thought about this about 10 minutes ago, right? Is that because we were talking about the question of, if we have them compose summaries, how do we process that? Well, we feed that shit right back into
the system.
Yeah. I mean, we're still gonna have to do some processing because we'll probably get more than 5.
Yeah. Yes, that's the thing is we're probably, I mean, the way I have it structured in the, like in the grant proposal, it's hundreds to potentially thousands. So, I mean, that's the difficulty is, but I mean, it's not like it's impossible. It just means what we have to then read through them and pick.
Well, and that raises the question too of, I mean, this is what's interesting about the participant versus subject distinction for me, which is useful, but in the terms of our project, we risk begging the question by using those because essentially to differentiate them, you'd have to have some notion of some normative notion you'd be using to, right? Because there's a sense in which within those individual tasks, we're essentially asking them to be subjects. But in that sense, but as soon as we have one hit where they generate summaries, and then that hit is then the result of that hit are then used to create additional hits, that becomes something that feels participatory now, right? Mm. But that participatory is an emergent quality of the hit, not tied to a particular, right? I mean, that's kind of what I mean by you can't know whether one was a subject or participant until after the thing is over. Because right, we might do things where we feel like, I mean, I'm thinking about, right, and I'm just thinking about this, right? When I go in and fill out a ballot, I mean, I'm potentially being asked to really be a subject at that moment, right? Here's the list, check them off, right? Just generate this usable, turn your preferences into a countable form, right? The me that fills out a ballot in that particular moment, I'm a subject, right? This is a government, right? But what that work as a subject allows me to do is to participate in an election, right? In that sense, I am in that moment, both,
right?
Depending on the task I'm enrolled in, right? That I'm filling out a form and a government generated form that's asking me to essentially quantify my complex views on something, right? In that sense, that's like any kind of, right, a research survey, right? I'm a subject in that sense, right? I'm not being allowed to decide who I can pick from, right? Like, here's your options. These are already been decided. Pick them, right? The process by which I'm enrolled in, right? I didn't decide on how elections work, right? I participated in none of that, right? I was born into a context in which every 4 years you vote for president. I didn't pick that. I'm subject to that. But all that work as a subject does, in some sense, allow me to participate in democracy.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, what's interesting is with the model like we kind of discussed, it also will start to skate the line between Turker as subject filling out stuff and Turker as composer. Because if we take their readable summaries and make that the question for the next one, it's like, well, you're also partially composing. And of course, we'd explicate this in the original hit in order to clarify this is what's going to happen to your work. Your work becomes the question for those after, right? I mean, you're not just pressing a button. It's like, well, what you're writing is going to be the question for the people who come behind you. Do you know what I mean? I mean, part of it. So you are partially a composer, not Turker as one doing the task. You're Turker as writing task, partially.
Yeah.
For the next person. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah. No, I like that. And I think too, that then allows us to do, I think it turns our engagement with Turks into something that's sort of more not in and out, but sort of sustained because it's iterative.
Yeah.
Right. That we're not doing this task and then this task because this task is folded through that one. And so we're much more in it, I guess.
Yeah.
In a sense.
And, there's also a way to do this in which, because, and I think you were alluding to this, like, so let's say we do this process and we do something like, maybe not hundreds. I mean, let's just make it concrete and say, let's say we did 100 hits and it was write a readable summary of this paragraph, right? And then if the next stage were, all right, well, you and me are going to look at this and pick 5 and then get, 1,000 results on which of these 5 is the most readable from other people. That's one way to go. Another way to go would be, because see, what we're doing at that point would be arguably imposing a kind of essentialist notion of what readability is, because it's like, well, once you pick those 5, it's like, well, what framework were you using? Because that's determinative right there.
Yeah.
I mean, what you've done is set the landscape. It's as though you're saying you can do anything you want as long as it's one of these 3 choices, right?
Right.
So it's utterly determinative in certain ways. So another way to approach this would just be something like, all right, what we're going to do is take the 100 ones we got and then just randomize that shit. So the hits are not identical.
Yeah, that's interesting.
The hits are, here's the paragraph, here are 5 random choices from that 100, and we want you to pick that out. Now on the back end, that gets a little fuzzy, because if what you really want is what's the most readable, what did the Turks say was the most readable summary, then it gets a little fuzzy, because it's like, well, this one got a lot of votes or something. I mean, you can do that.
Yeah.
But there is also the larger scale question of, do we really care?
No, I mean, I think this gets back. We do. That in many ways, what we're going to then, so let's then jump ahead to, okay, now we're going to write this shit up. What we're going to probably spend the most time writing up is not the results of our readability survey. It's going to be describing what happened while we did this, right? That's the interesting part. I mean, that's then the kind of ethnographic part, right? That at the end, it turns out that we might notice a trend amongst what readability got decided, but probably what we'll end up spending the most words describing is, here's how we moved from iteration to iteration of this.
Yeah.
Describing is not what readability is, but readability as an activity, right? What is it to think through and generate readability in this system?
Well, and I think Kagel kind of brought this up, because I mean, like in the final analysis, I think she's going to point out, it's like, well, do we really want a readable summary of this hypothetical paragraph? No, we don't. I mean, we haven't even discussed what it is. It's just gibberish paragraph at this point.
Right.
It's a MacGuffin. It's like, so, I mean, that's very different than someone who is doing this for like machine learning purposes, where it's like, well, it's different for 2 things. It's different than someone who would do this to train machine learning, where they might say, well, yeah, I don't really care. It's just like, this is the tool I need to use in order for me to have a body of data that I can then feed into a machine. But we're not even doing that. And then there's another person who says, well, yeah, it's like, let's say I work at a business and I have like a 10,000 customer comment sheets. And it's like, I'm not going to read those. So I'm going to give them to Turkers. And I just want them to say, what's each person saying here? So it's like, yeah, I want the data. I want those summaries. It's just, I want them in a format I can actually read. So I'm going to give it to the Turk. That's one thing. It's a different thing for someone to say, I don't really care about the data, but I need to train a robot to do this. That's another thing. And we're doing something separate, which is like, I'm not sure we really care about the summary, but we kind of want to know about the process.
Yeah, or really I just made a note while you were talking, right? Moving away from the question of what is readability to more along the lines of what is made of readability. That is, how does readability as a concept organize intelligence tasks? I mean, that's the rhetorical, right? How does the concept of readability organize labor or human intelligence tasks within mechanical Turks?
Yeah.
So not even right. So we're not interested in we're not really interested in what readability is, because from a disciplinary standpoint, that's a philosophical question. I actually don't care what readability is. We care about what readability does.
Yeah.
Readability doing in mechanical Turks. And how can we set up a series of hits that allow us to not generate readability, not even really understand what people mean by readability, but what does readability itself as a kind of rhetorical agent do in this system?
So then the $1 million question is, how do we set up hits that do that?
That's great. You put your hood on, which means, it's go time.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think and I think what I'm excited about our conversation today is that I think what we're moving towards is this is now, we still don't have to do that work of, right, what do these individual hits look like? But I think what we're hitting on, pun intended, is that really we have to think about a sequence of interrelated hits. So we need to think, I think, at the level not just of how do we compose this hit, but how do we compose and then sequence, or you know what I mean? Like,
yeah,
I think to do that, we're not going to do that in a hit. We're going to do it along a series of hits.
But would it include, I mean, thinking concretely, explicit invocation of readability as a concept to the degree of, to the degree of, quite literally generate a readable 1-sentence summary of this, generate a 1-sentence caption for this image, a readable 1-sentence caption. I mean, to the degree of, do we literally invoke the language? Do you think? I mean, we don't have to make the decision now. It's just, that's a question.
I think so. And then maybe to go back to another thing we were discussing, do we this gets big really quick, right? Do we not? Yes, we do invoke readability, but in some hits we invoke legibility, or in some hits we evoke accuracy, right? So that we essentially have a list of conceptual, potentially synonyms for readability. But you see, right, that now we're doing that whole sequence, but we're doing it 10 times.
Well, but I mean, maybe not. I mean, envision a hit where the first step is write a readable 1-sentence summary of this paragraph. The second step is we take the results, those sentences, we pop them randomly into hits we post at the same time, but one hit asks, select the most readable, right? The other hit says select the most legible. Another hit says select the most accurate.
Yeah, so we introduce that at the second stage.
Now, see, the thing of it is, if you had the same options at that second stage, you could hypothetically then see patterns. Here's what they selected when you say readable. Here's what they selected when you say accuracy. That does then put you back in the position of doing pre-selection. If you just do random ones, you'd have to see in the data, it's like, did certain options get routinely selected as readable and a different one got routinely selected as accurate, right? I mean, you just have messier data, because it'd be like, well, this one got, I mean, if you really wanted to muck this up, instead of saying pick the best, you'd say rank these 4, most readable to least readable. And then it's like ranked choice voting, to use your analogy, where it's like the one that gets ranked number 1 gets 4 points, the one that's ranked number 2. Now, setting that up.
Yeah. I mean, given the division of labor, is that something you want to do?
Well, I mean, there's a way probably to do this with what is essentially, like survey, one of the major, because I mean, like, I think at our university, we have access to a few of the different, because there are software packages that do this.
Yeah. Right? Qualtrics is one of our.
Qualtrics, and I can't remember what we have here, but that are, I mean, they're designed for this.
Yeah.
For survey questions and then handling that. So, I mean, this may not be a big hurdle, but I mean, conceptually, the thing of it is we could, and I mean, that's the advantage of scale, is if you only had a Psych 101 class to do that, if you had a lower number of subjects / participants, it's like, well, I mean, the data will be too thin. It'd be like, well, this gets 1 vote and that gets 2. It's like, oh, that's too thin. So I'm going to have to pre-select 5 choices and then see the differences there. But if you can do it at scale, where, say you have 100 choices, they're going to get spat out randomly into this question. It's like, well, if you have 10,000 people, I mean, we probably don't have the money for that, but if you have 10,000 people look at that, you probably could start to see, a breakdown of, well, this got, 1,000 votes and this one got 89. It's like, the advantage of scale is you can do that.
Yeah. But you're right, scale becomes potentially an issue for us in several regards.
I should have asked for more money.
Yeah. There's something coming up in January, I think, at my institution. So, but all of our little grants are like seed grant things. So I don't know if I could. Yeah.
No, but I mean, there's ways to do this.
Yeah.
Well, and also, I mean, what I was saying is, so if that was straight up the situation of, step 1, step 2, you could, in theory, get information out of, well, they deemed this most readable, Turk deemed this most accurate, and those are not the same thing. But there's another way to do this in which, again, is that what we want, or is that a MacGuffin, and what we really want is something else on those hits, like, read produce a 1-sentence summary of this paragraph. Question 2, do you think you were fairly compensated for the labor you were asked to do, right?
Yeah.
And then step 2, pick which of these 4 options, which were previously generated in a different hit, as the most readable or accurate or whatever. Question 2, do you think you were fairly compensated for that or whatever? I mean, is what we want an actual clarification of the differences between readability and accuracy or whatever, or is that a feint?
Yeah.
Yet it's some other aspect. I mean, we haven't even talked about like the metadata aspects of if these are compensated at different rates, for example.
Yeah.
Which step 1 and step 2 would be, because you're asking people to write versus to choose. But, if step 2 is we don't drill into the different terms, we just say for all of the hits, which is the most readable sentence summary of this paragraph, but in some versions of those hits, you're paid a dime.
Yeah.
Other versions of those hits, you're paid a quarter. Do the results change?
Yeah. Well, and I think given what we know of some of these possible third-party tools, that for some Turkers, the dime one doesn't show up because they've right. I have to assume that one of the ways in which these third-party applications work is it helps Turkers sort through the kinds of jobs they're interested in doing. And some Turkers may do it by compensation level, so they never see hits that have a compensation level below a certain threshold.
Or at least they'd be ranked differently. So, I mean, okay. So, well, we're already at an hour, so we'll wrap up pretty soon here. But so the thing of it is, it's not like any of this is undoable. It's just this is the usual problem we often have, which is you just have to pick something.
Yep.
And go with it. Because, I mean, the common problem here is once new questions start getting asked, start thinking about, well, how are we going to account for this? How are we going to account for this? And it's like, ultimately, the answer is, well, you don't. You're going to pick one of these things. You can't do everything simultaneously. That's the answer.
Yeah, that's what your methods section is for. Here's all the shit we didn't do alongside
Right.
stuff we did.
I mean, I've been talking with students about that. It's like every research paper answers a question, but it asks new questions, right? That's part of it. But you don't then have to answer those questions in that paper. That's what the next project is.
That's actually conversations I also have with my instructors, because we do the big project we do is a dissologoy, right, where the students look at multiple sides, and
Yeah,
almost always the instructor, when we do grade calibrations, will be like, yeah, and then the student just raises this issue and never then comes back to it. I'm like, yeah, that's a positive result of their dissologoy, right? They wrote themselves into a problem. Right, that's the dissologoy is designed to create controversies, not settle them. Right, that's its point. Its point is to leave a bunch of shit hanging, because not leaving it hanging will have been to have weighed in, which means it's no longer a dissologoy, right? Yeah. So it's weird that oftentimes even instructors will want to sort of, ding a dissologoy for it. It raised a bunch of questions that it didn't answer. I'm like, yeah, no, that's actually what a good version of that thing looks like.
Well, it's the difference between that as an exercise and like an essay where our expectations are a line. You move point to point to point. I was just talking to an honor student about this, whereas, dissologoy and germinal stages of projects, I often see them visually where it's like, well, you have this point and then it starts breaking off. It starts, rhizomatically fracturing off. And you start thinking, how am I going to deal with all this? It's like, well, you don't. For an essay, you pick one of those lines and you go bop, 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 bop. You trim away the other branches, knowing you're going to deal with those differently.
Yeah.
Anywho.
You take those, you graft them on someplace else.
Yeah, I mean, that's your next paper is those lines you didn't pursue.
Yeah. Right. And then, I mean, this is, when the grad student, the fake conversation between Latour and the grad student in the introduction to actor network theory, like, well, how would I know when I'm done? And he's just like, I don't know, you'll get to 50,000 words.
Yeah.
We're never going to be done. Right. The idea, because the student wants a framework that will contain their project. And the response is, yeah, that's not how this works, right? When will I be done answering this question? Probably when you die and you can't, you'll never get to the bottom of this.
Right. Yeah. But then, as we're encountering if nothing else, practical reasons, it's like, yeah, but at some point you'll draw a circle on a paper.
Yeah.
What we're writing is a paper. We're not going to answer the full question. We're writing a paper.
Well, that's the limit, right? Well, we can answer about as much as one can reasonably answer in a 10,000 word thing that someone's likely to read. That's what we can do. Because it also has to be something that people will want to read, which also constrains the kinds of things that we talk about and the questions that we pursue. I mean, again, right? I mean, I think it lucks out. We're both also interested in readability, but it's not coincidental that for a piece aimed at rhetoric scholars, readability is the thing, right? Why are you digging into that? Because we think it will be cooler for our audience than if we pick something else.
Yeah.
Like, it's why we didn't go with trauma. That's because that's not as linked to our field as something like readability is.
Yeah.
So it's an audience question too.
Yeah, it's relevance. And I mean, in order for it to do its job, it has to be accessible in particular ways. Well, so anywho, I guess we'll wrap up. But I mean, I think maybe then we can think about in terms of, because we haven't changed the notion of what we're going to be doing is asking. We're going to post some hits and get some feedback, right?
That's, I think, I'm still on board for that.
Question now is, what are they going to be? Is it going to be sequential? I mean, something that came out of this conversation is the potential for something like a sequence wherein Turkers become both subjects, but also sort of partial participants through the avenue of being composers.
Yeah. Right. That the knowledge that gets generated by the second step will be in part generated by people who participated in the first one.
Yes, is contingent on kind of that first.
Yeah.
Okay. Well,
Wonder then if that's actually, yeah, never mind.
write it down so you don't forget.
Yeah. I mean, at some point, this is going to go back to you and I's favorite question. Like, we're going to have to get this bonus situation sorted out. I mean, that's like compensation level. Like, that's what we're kind of.
Yeah, I mean, I've been, and you know, I did when I wrote the grant proposal, I was thinking about compensation because, you know, in this format, really compensation seems to be a factor of duration. How long is this going to take me to do?
Yeah.
It's interesting because, and this is something the first one looked at, there weren't necessarily bright lines about what is this asking me to do, you know, the lines weren't quite as bright about like, is this asking for a kind of cognitive labor that I see as more intense or more valuable, right? Smart guy labor versus just rote labor. The lines weren't super bright. The lines were a little brighter with sort of like, well, how long is this going to take me to do?
Which is a really interesting take on Polanyi's paradox, right? That it's actually, yeah. I mean, it's actually, it turns out that what makes something human or not, well, how long does it take a human? Like it's not their capacity for the subject matter or the content. It's something temporal.
Yeah. You wonder if that's an artifact of sort of being an industrial society where, you know, labor units are clock driven. It's like, I mean, that really is sort of still the schism of smart guy versus rote labor is, do you punch a clock?
Yeah.
Not, right?
But yeah, but also, I mean, there's also, you can really expand from it that though, it's like, you know, like human beings have certain capacities to like, you know, we can easily cut down a tree. Well, so can wind. It just takes it longer. Like those capacities exist. And sometimes we don't notice those capacities because they don't take place in a particular scale. I mean, if you look at things from a geological perspective, right? The whole environment's built. We're just not around long enough to see it get built by things.
Yeah.
Like human beings, right? We're really good at, we can design and dig a hole and fill it with cement and make a pool. It's like, yeah, are you aware of glacial lakes? Like ice can do that quite competently. It just takes it millions of years.
Yeah, and there's a difference between something being simple and easy, right? I mean, that example right there, it's simple to dig an 8-foot hole, but it's not easy. It's simple because the parameters of the task are utterly clear, right? It's like, okay, well, I get it, but it's not easy. I'm going to be doing this all day and it's going to break my back, right? There are things that are simple and then there are things that are easy and those are not, I mean, those cross where it's like, it's simple, i.e. the parameters are clear, but it's easy or it's hard versus it's complex, right? I mean, simple's partner there in that scenario is complex, not hard.
Yeah.
It's this complicated, but it could still be very easy or it could be very difficult.
And of course, right, easy and all those terms are presumed relative to a particular kind of body, right?
Yeah.
Easier for a grown adult, much harder for if my daughter had to dig an 8-foot hole, right? Even its easiness is contingent upon the body available, the tools available, right? Easier with a shovel than it is with hands, right? I mean, there's at no point where you actually know whether this job is easy or not, because its easiness is a relational component, is a quality, not inherent in the labor itself, right? Is this job human or not? I can't tell you yet.
Yeah.
You're going to have to do it and find out. It's a human job if a human has a week to do it, this set of tools,
a shovel,
background, and this level of compensation, right? All those things are equally important to its essential humanness.
Yeah. Well, we can go ahead and wrap up. Do you want to try and for next time come back with like draft hits?
I think that's our those are our marching orders.
I think it'd be interesting because, you know, we don't We try as much as possible not to talk about this project significantly in private formats. We try and do this because we're trying to expose the machinery.
Yeah, I hope that's obvious that this,
Yeah.
otherwise we're in trouble. Like, oh no, this is all scripted, baby.
Yeah. But I mean, what I'm trying to communicate is it's not like we then, after this is over, spend a lot of time in, private formats saying, what about this? And how do we do that? I mean, mostly this takes place through these. So it would be interesting for us to go off and, sort of independently come up with, here are some hits that I think, or here's what, a hit sequence would look like, a hit list.
Yeah. That's what it's calling, and that's what I'm calling it now. Yeah, no, I think people don't recognize this. The secret to this, at least I think you could call it contingently successful collaboration, is we really don't actually like spending time together. So it means that when we get together for these 2 weeks, that is it. And otherwise, really, I don't really want to see him until 2 weeks from now.
Yeah, the labor for this is done in the half hour before we go live.
Yeah. Yeah. It's known publicly as the Follow Mechanical Turks. Privately, it's known as the, oh shit, I got to talk to Jeremy in 30 minutes project.
It's on my calendar every Friday, because the Fridays we don't meet, I have a different project that's kind of like this. So every Friday at 9, I've got, I need to prepare for that.
Yeah.
All right. Well, at least we know what we do for next time.
Yeah. No, I think this is a good app, I think. So
yeah, and it also touched upon, it touched upon the I think the salience of our most recent guests.
Yeah.
In terms of, I think they've had a large role in kind of shaping.
No, in fact, I tweeted out an announcement that we were talking, but I think I'm gonna, when the link is, when the recording is up, I think that's at least related to the sort of the other goals of this project, that I think this is going to be one of those episodes that really, like, you can still feel the lingering impact of the people that we talked to over the last month is still pretty palpable. So that's in itself, I think, a positive result.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right, then I'll see you in a fortnight.
Indeed.
With hits.
Yes, because we have a hit list now.